Hello, everyone. Welcome back to James's interviews. It's been a while. This is the first episode of 2022. So, a very late, happy New Year to everyone. This is episode 16 with my guest, Father Monk Patrick Ramsey. Father, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. Very well.
Yeah, and just to get a clarification, so I know we're going to be talking about Orthodox perspective on primacy and ecclesiology from your book, The Church, Deifying Relations, and I'll put a link for Amazon for your book in the description below in the show notes. But before I get in, I just want to get like the title correct. So your birth name or secular name is John Ramsey, and then your religious clerical name is Monk Patrick or Patrick Ramsey?
Yes. So I was, I was born, the secular name is John Ramsey, yes. And then when I became Orthodox, actually baptized John again, but when I became a monk, and since then as a priest, I've been known as Patrick. So I use both names. So I haven't changed the name legally. So when I do things that are sort of books and stuff, I tend to put them in my legal name rather than my church name. Or sometimes I'll put Patrick in with it, depending on the situation. So,
gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that clarification because I've heard. I'm always interested, especially like in various religious names. I know with like Catholics and Orthodox, there's different things with that. And sometimes you'll see the same person with a different either middle name or last name or whatever. I'm like, wait a second, like, is this the same person? I have to double check. Oh yeah, it is. It's just that's their clerical name. So yeah, but what I'll do real quick is read a bio of yours that I found from the Institute for Orthodox Christian Studies, Cambridge distance learning tutors. So Father Patrick Ramsey is a priest monk from New Zealand who is now serving in the UK in the Western Rite Vicarate of the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. He earned a PhD from Winchester University in Orthodox Theology in the field of ecclesiology, with a thesis presenting a model of the church based on relationships within the church. Previously, he graduated with a MTH in Orthodox Theology from the University of Wales, Trinity St David. His master's thesis on the clergy of the church, focusing on the minor orders and deaconesses, has been published as a book and translated into Romanian and Greek and received a good review. His special interests are in the hierarchies of the church, particularly the relations of the primary bishops in the church, but also extending down to relations with local churches and parishes, and also that of monasteries and families, and in the Trinity, especially in regard to the intra-Trinitarian relations. He has a deep interest in the liturgy and enjoys studying medieval and pre-medieval liturgical manuscripts of both Eastern and Western liturgical rites. He has spent time on Mt Athos, gaining experience of monastic spiritual life and practice. So that's a pretty good summary I found. So I was like, oh, this is very detailed and informative. So yeah, it's kind of funny because like I'm a very big Star Wars fan, and so like growing up, like the first time I ever heard a New Zealand accent was the actor of Jango Fett, the bounty hunter, and then later to be Boba Fett now. And I was like, because at first when I was little and I heard that, I'm like, that sounds British or Australian, but like there's something different about it. And then later on, when I when I found out when I was a kid about New Zealand, and I was like, oh, hey, so there you go. So, but that's all pretty cool. So, your accents will make things sound more interesting.
yes.
I always just find British accents and New Zealand and Australian accents just fun.
Yes.
So, well, with all that said, Father, let me just ask you, my first question for you is, why did you write this book?
Well, it's a book is just basically a publication of my PhD thesis. And when I was starting my master's thesis, I had two topics of long-term interest. As one was a minor clergy of a church, the roles of readers and chanters and things. based a lot on the canons of the church, and then studying that, and also an interest in the primacies of the church, and the primacy of Constantinople, of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And so those were two sort of ways of things I was interested in. And so we decided that the minor clergy was better for a master's thesis, which was a smaller topic, and then we did the other one for the, my PhD. And while doing the PhD, it sort of evolved a bit from just simply talk about primacy to a whole theory of church relationships based around hierarchy. So it sort of broadened out into sort of deeper theory, which I thought was quite good. I got quite happy with it in the end, from my perspective. But yes, some people don't quite seem to get their head around it. I've had people both say that it's clericalism and it's non-clericalism. So.
That's it. That's interesting that some would call it clericalism. I guess I could kind of see, but I'm not. Yeah, but yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. Like, that's an interesting reception of your work, at least.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised with that. I thought, no, it's not. It's hierarchical. It's definitely hierarchical, but clericalism, I don't. I'm not so. I was a bit surprised at that critique of it as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. So to kind of get into that a little bit more, or kind of starting somewhat backwards, as it were, in your book, what I want to do is, a second here. So I want to ask you first, before we talk about other things related to primacy, is about your specific and unique contribution, which is your notion of theodic relationships. So what is a theodic relationship, and how does that flesh out in terms of like primacy?
That's it goes deep into it. Theodic relationships are relationships that lead us to union with God. Theosis is being union with God, or deification. And so this union with God is manifest or realized through our human relationships. And these relationships are like living icons. And the classic is in marriage. In the scriptures, it talks about the husband as Christ and the wife as the church. And this sets up an iconic relationship as icons. And in becoming one flesh, and the wife doing obedience to her husband, the husband loving his wife, sacrifice himself for his wife, the two actually become united to God. The husband, because he acts as God, he does as God, so he becomes like God in all his activity. And the wife, for undoing the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the first place, brings herself into one will, one mind, one heart, and one body with God through this relationship. And so you have, through the union relationship of marriage, you have a union with God, because the mindset, the principle of being one body, the mindset of unity, of one mind, one heart, together in all things, is realized in the practical, human, tangible way. It's all very nice to talk about union with God, but until you actually manifest true obedience, true love, true sacrifice, and these things in a real human-to-human relationship. But is established, though, in a mystery that relationship builds onto God. So it's not just the relationship as an end in itself. It has to be one that's filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit. It has to be one sort of recognized in the church. And both parties must be in the church, that the relationship may be fulfilled not as just this human end, but as a divine end. And so the marriage is a basic one. That also extends into monastic relationships. So the abbot has a similar relationship as sort of God to or as Christ to his disciples, to the other monks, who treat him as Christ in obedience and everything. This is again, it's the same thing as a husband and wife relationship, but just manifests between monk and nuns, or abbess and the monk and abbot and monks, I should say. And abbess.
Right.
Get that correct. Right, and then that extends also to the public sphere. So in the parishes, you've got the laity with the parish priest, who sets as Christ among them, and through the obedience to him and following his teachings, etc., they come into union with the church as such, and then he is unified with his bishop. So he doesn't act without the consent of a bishop. He serves on the altar consecrated by the bishop, using holy myrrh for chrismation, that is consecrated by the bishop. It's like the bishop, apostles laid their hands on, or the bishop in the West more laying on hands. It's about the bishop unifies the priesthood, and so that the operation of the priesthood is one. It's not many priesthoods, it's not many churches, it's one priesthood. And then the bishops themselves are unified around their metropolitans and synods, and they in turn unified around patriarchs. And then you have a special place for the Petrine sees, being Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, and Constantinople, or New Rome. And because they converge to one, Rome stands out as a particular prominence among them and unifying them. So yes, it's a whole sort of layers of relationships. And so, as St. Ignatius says, we united the church by being united with the priest or with the bishop. But it's not just to get to know the bishop. It's not just being friends with the bishop. The relationship has to be realized through the mysteries. And so that one has to be baptized into the church. You can't just sort of come in and say hello and be a member of the church. You've got to be baptized. So the relationship is established through baptism, and is maintained through the Eucharist, the holy body and blood of Christ, which makes us one body physically together. Marriage is something that has a certain rite to it. So it's a publicly recognized relationship. It's not just people just cohabiting. It has to be one that's publicly recognized as the blessing of God. A monastic thing is a certain vows, etc. Again, it becomes a formalized relationship and formalized within the sort of rites of the church for its benefit. And then the Holy Spirit enters and transforms the relationship, which is like a living icon of our union with God, and brings us into union with God. So that was the contribution, and it was to deal with and Orthodox is called Eucharistic Ecclesiology, which is based on the Eucharist uniting. And I've sort of said that doesn't allow for spiritual elders. It doesn't really explain marriage. It doesn't explain monasticism very well. And so shifting the thing onto personal relationships, that you are united through your personal relationships. This way you either become married or you go into monastery. You have to be a member of a parish. You can't be a Christian apart from your bishop and priest without going to church and taking of the mysteries and stuff. These relationships are cool, but they are established through the mystery. So they're established and maintained through the Eucharist, but it's not the Eucharist. The Eucharist fulfills everything, but we need the relationships, and therefore the relationship with monastic elder, etc., is all very important to our union with God, is coming under this principle of obedience to another, or at least not acting without their consent. So you truly become one mind with someone else. And that makes a more holistic sense of unity, because God is personal. God's not just a body. He is a personal being, and we must come into union with him in a complete sense. Yes, so that was the basic idea of theodic relationships, are sort of iconic human relations filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit, through the rites of the church, which bring us into union with God.
Yeah, thank you, Father. That's very helpful. I also just found it a very interesting and creative type of outlook and method, because it seems like, what you're doing is you're uniting soteriology with ecclesiology, and specifically deification and theosis. Because it seems like most conversations on, at least that I've read, I mean, there's a lot that I haven't read, but most of the time whenever I'm reading, whether it's Eastern or Western perspectives on theosis or deification, it's usually in the context of, talking about holiness, sanctity, union with God, and the connection with like the intercession of the saints, and so forth. But tying it with ecclesiology, I mean, it actually just makes sense too, because it's like, well, wait a second, if you have a community of people that their goal is to reach theosis, then there's going to be some type of society, and that society is the church. And like, as they're going through this process, they have to be doing something, like they have to have some type of relationship with each other, and especially with like hierarchical structures in the church. So that actually just kind of makes so much intuitive sense. And so I guess my question is, why do you think people, at least to my knowledge, I mean, I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like people have really addressed this in the way that you have before, at least like these specific words, or am I wrong? Have they? Like, what basically, why does this kind of seem to have been missing from kind of like the literature on ecclesiology?
Good question. In some ways it hasn't been, in some ways it has been. I think if you look back at the writings of the Desert Fathers, St. Ignatius of Antioch, the whole monastic tradition, the idea of this iconic living relation, I mean, the scriptures, of course, have got the husband and wife. It's there. It is. I think it's quite clear. This type of obedience relationship to an elder being Christ, and this type of thing, this mystery is well known in the church. I think what's happened is rather in more modern times, 19th, 20th century, people have been trying to find a way of expressing this in sort of more philosophical, theological terms rather than the practical nuts and bolts. Well, more philosophical terms, I should suppose, to say, rather than theological, because the theological is the spiritual things. And they've sort of concentrated on baptism. And they haven't, I don't think anyone's sort of quite got there. Now, there have been streams of it. When I built up the things, I found bits and pieces everywhere, sort of partially said here, partially said here. It's just drawing all the strings together, trying to go, oh, actually, this... because I suppose I looked at Dionysius the Areopagite, and he basically talks about this in Maximus Confessor, and then suddenly it's sort of all linked together. And so I put back what a lot of people were sort of reaching around and talking about, sort of bits and pieces, but never quite putting it together. And I think it was coming from putting the theosis idea, I think, in there with icons and with the sort of relationship built around the sacraments, mysteries. So one way of talking about it is a lot of people talked about the bishop, or Metropolitan Zizioulas, John Zizioulas talks about the bishop for the Eucharist, and I've just twisted, modified slightly. The Eucharist is for the bishop. And so the Eucharist is the mysteries used by the bishop to unite people to himself, to him in a sense, and thus to God, rather than him being appointed just simply for serving the Eucharist or the liturgy. The Eucharist is a tool used along with baptism, etc., to fulfill the relationship, which is focused on the person of the bishop, which you see in Ignatius. So I think it's just people in modern times haven't really put it down. And I think earlier times, there wasn't a need to sort of describe it in this sort of way, because you're having people trying to put these other models and thoughts out. So it's sort of like in the context of what modern people are doing, I'm going, oh, they're not quite working right. I think which one John Zizioulas' PhD, I read it, and there's certain parts of it just didn't quite come together right. It was especially the way he dealt with the priesthood. He was sort of talking about a change in what is happening with the presbyters from the 4th century. And I thought, I don't like this idea. We're proposing to change it. That somehow the order of the presbyter suddenly changed from being a non-priest to a priest due to something. That didn't seem right. Whereas the way the solution is actually the presbyter and the bishop are much closer together as priests right from the word go. And it actually explains a lot more other things that go on in the New Testament better as a model. So I thought, it just seems like a better model.
Yeah, thank you, Father. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess one point of clarification, I should have worded that question better, because it does seem to me with many subjects that there's so much richness and depth in the church fathers. It really continues to kind of fascinate me how perceptive they were. And since the Enlightenment and other issues in recent history, recent Western history that has also extended globally as well in influence and reach, things such as whether it's certain types of skepticism or empiricism. There's a line that C.S. Lewis had about chronological snobbery, where a lot of Enlightenment figures and then other moderns have the idea that we know better than those in the past because we have either better technology, and that's great. Like, technology is great, don't get me wrong, but I think what's interesting though is, like, when I read some of these writers, like St. Maximus the Confessor, I'm sort of like, this guy seems to really know what it actually means to be human in just a more intuitive, logical way. Like, even if you left religion out of it, it's just like, this guy actually seems more just wise and smart. And like, that's the other thing too, is like, there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. Like, I'm all for knowledge and like free inquiry and everything, but like, wisdom is something I think that we're losing a lot. It's, it's the difference between not knowledge is like, you get nuclear physics and stuff, but the difference between wisdom or goodness and justice and stuff is like using nuclear physics to build power plants that help crops and irrigation, whereas the same knowledge could be used by the Soviet Union or communist China to make weapons of mass destruction to world domination, basically. I do find it interesting, though, how there's just so much richness to the patristic tradition. And then kind of going back what you were saying, though, relating it back more to your book specifically, is that it does, like, so when I was talking about the literature, I did actually mean, yes, you're right, like more modern times, but by both Catholic and Orthodox, though, too, which that is kind of surprising, because both traditions say they're following the church fathers. And I understand there's a difference between, like, the actual faithfulness of like an individual theologian and his individual consistency versus like the communion as a whole. Like, I'm to be fair, but yeah, because yeah, anyway, that's kind of just my thoughts on that. But I did want to just kind of briefly, to kind of close this section about theodic relationships, just for everyone here. One thing I've always found very helpful is, like, and it's just a very simple thing, I'm a simple guy, is just table of contents really help, just like let you know what you're going to get into, which is kind of like, no duh, but like in the book by Adler, How to Read a Book, he like actually is like, no, studying table of contents is actually really important. So in that spirit, like, because it's chapter 4 that you talk about the notion of theodic relationships, and you talk about how do theodic relationships function, theosis and the hierarchy, the place of St. Peter, as you said, the Trinity and the hierarchy, institutional or charismatic, discipleship, liturgical life, commandments and consensus, Simeon's chain, and then your conclusion. And then later you go on to implications. What I want to ask you, speaking of patristics, because there's so many ways or errors we could go through this, but why did you find particularly Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite to be influential in your work? What made you focus on him specifically?
Good question. I just think his way of theology just is very, very profound. And for the topic, when I sort of read his ecclesiastical hierarchy, it just put things in the right way. I mean, that's why the fathers sort of so he's a great theologian. St. Maximus sort of looks up to him with awe, sort of things. And Gregory Palamas said the fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council sort of rate him very highly. But I find his theology very deep, very profound, and extremely Christian. I'm not one of these people. A lot of people have criticized him being a neo-Palamite or influence and stuff. But no, to me, he is the essence of Christian, the philosophical thought and theology. And if your thinking is Neoplatonite, then you're probably not really actually thinking in a Christian way. This sort of thing. So now I just sort of just enjoyed reading him. I think the ecclesiastical hierarchy which I used was most interesting to me. And yeah, I just, as I say, I fell in love with him, one of a better word. But it really, his writings really helped to sort of give the sense of theosis. That really talks about the hierarchical, the diversity, the unions, etc. It just the language and the concepts, conceptual structure which was needed for the models. So. And then with that, the whole thing with St. Peter, what becomes central to this is as well. The place of St. Peter's, I originally called the work, well, I did it as I called it in the PhD title. It just is, again, this whole sense of one being pulled out of many for purpose of unity. But then with that, it's the whole concept of the theotic relationships that are built on a certain understanding of the image of God in each of us. And that image of God has, I think, three things which I point out. One is man is rational, works by reason. The other one is that each person has authority. We are to reign with God, and we have authority. And that authority is freely exercised. So there's an absolute freedom of exterior compulsion. God is free from any exterior compulsion. And we, in his image, must be free from any exterior compulsion, including the compulsion of God. Otherwise, if he tries to compel us like a robot, he would destroy his own image in us and deny our salvation. So we must come freely to him. And we must, to be like him, we must have authority as he has authority. And so this means that there is both a place for everybody has given a place to rule. And so in every theological relationship, everyone has a space to rule. So a husband, for example, rules his house, but the wife rules the children, and the children should rule their own little space, or the pets or something like that. Everyone should be given a space where they're in charge. And actually, that's another important thing about the whole thing. It's all based around territory or space. So each human has their space. A man leaves his father's rule, his father's house, his father's place, and then goes and sets up his own home. It becomes his place. He's the lord of his place. And the wife is a sort of a lord of the children in a sense. And then the parish priest is a lord of his parish, and that's his space, and everything should be territorialized. The bishop is a lord of his territory, the metropolitan of his province, the patriarch of his region, and so on up. And because of, and part of the important part of this is that the relationships must respect the authority and freedom of each part. There's never force. A husband never beats his wife into submission, or never emotionally blackmails. So she's totally free. Her obedience is from her. She owes the obedience. He can extol her, can preach to her, all the rest of it, but he can't get to stay emotionally blackmailing and forcing her, because that would destroy the image of God in her. So if she wishes to be disobedient and stuff, he must live with her as such and never start trying to beat her into submission. That is a contrary to the Christian way. And the wife, on the other hand, must see her husband as Christ and obey him in all things, and not pick and choose. The only discernment is that to realize that the husband is a man and not simply Christ, and to be this. Oh yes, actually, this is the other very important part of it. As discern, and he can make mistakes. Now, part of that making mistakes is that our actions, we are all have our own authority and freedom for everything we do. So where it's a little bit different to some other obediences, the theory I'm putting forward, the way of understanding it, is that you're responsible for what you obey. So that you obey with some discernment. So if someone tells you to go and murder somebody, you go, no, I'm not going to go and commit a sin because that person has told me to do something contrary to God, because obedience is only in God. So you only obey as far as it's consistent with God. And so if you do it, you are responsible for the action because it's your free action. But obedience is not being cutting yourself to become the union is not like a servant or a slave who is beaten into it, where you're forced to do it against your will, or you're doing it not really to your will, but you're getting a reward. A true obedience is being one mind. It's taking the other person's will and making it your own, and it becomes your will. And becomes this is a true obedience. This is a true freedom, is the obedience of the Son. It becomes your will, and so this is proper obedience. It becomes your will. You're responsible for it. So this is why we must be careful not to force us something. And obedience is not sort of an absolute sense. You're free towards, and you need to do so with discernment. This is why the obedience is within the law of God, within the canons of the church. A bishop is not absolute ruler. He rules only within the canons of the church. If he steps outside, he himself can be deposed for failing to teach according to Christ. So we live to obedience of the God's law ultimately, but we need to practice this in obedience to humans. And by default, we obey unless we're sure. Otherwise, you end up doing self-will, which is disastrous. So even if a person says go and throw someone in the fire, that's a different thing. They're not saying go and murder the person. They're saying go and throw the person in the fire. Well, I don't. Okay, it seems it might die if they throw them in the fire, but I will go and do it. And then usually, if you take that obedience and do it, not imagining yourself the result. And then the person, God will step in and save the person, showing you a good, like Isaac and Abraham. Now that was even more strict. Go and sacrifice your son. But to say and go murder somebody, that is actually asking them to do something which is naming the sin. And so you step back and say, no, I'm not going to. And so you've got to be, so it can get grey. There's a grey area sometimes. And there's sometimes the right and the wrong. There's a perfect way of doing this and there's a less perfect way. But we are to be free and we are responsible for our actions. So that's a very important part. And the idea of jurisdiction. You have a territory where you're boss in your jurisdiction and you're not boss elsewhere. A man is not boss in someone else's house. And also you're not boss in that you've got to respect the jurisdiction of those under you. So a presbyter is not boss inside the house of each man and how the man runs his own house. Even though the presbyter may teach the law of God, which might deal with when you could sleep and when you should fast and all the rest of it, what time you can have sex and all this. As far as the law of God goes for those things, the priest preaches those. But for a matter of the management of a house where you stick your chair in the house and what time you wake up in the morning, etc., that's not his business to be interfering with that, because it's losing respect of the man in his house. And so the husband should let the wife rule the children. If he's got an issue, he pulls her aside and talks with her about it. They never countermands, so there's always one will and stuff. And this is good parenting. You shouldn't do this, but the theory says this is exactly how you shouldn't. If you've got a problem, you take them aside. But otherwise, you always speak as one and allow the wives then support the wife and of the children. But you have the overall view, and so you sometimes say, well, we choose to move this way with children, we should be going that way, and she can implement it as such. And the children should look after their rooms, though you can tell the children to keep it tidy. You don't start going tidying it for them. Put things where they around here. So anyway, it's this whole principle, and this is where it starts going important to the greater hierarchical relationships. So when we're starting to talk about the primacy of the metropolitans, the patriarchs, and then the primacy of Rome. And this, I think, is where the thought of the papacy in the 11th century, but it sort of comes out from the 9th century onwards. It's a growing, developing thing. But it's clear a thought change in the 11th century where this is where it changes. It's the respect of the jurisdictions of those underneath. It contradicts and the Vatican I that does that. It contradicts this respect of a jurisdiction underneath the limits of a higher regards to the lower. It claimed a jurisdiction which was disrespectful of the one below it and their own rights. And so that's where in Orthodoxy it suddenly becomes unacceptable. It's not primacy per se, it's not even jurisdiction over all the world, it's not certain actions and things like that. It's a specific sense that and it's expressed that they can ordain a clergyman in any diocese directly of their own will, which is where the actual rubber hits the road, which is expressed in sort of Vatican I, whereas in Orthodox, no, only the local bishop can ordain a cleric in his, and no one else has any right to interfere. Doesn't matter, patriarch, metropolitan, or whatever. It's his job and his job alone to do that. That's his jurisdiction, and no one should interfere with that. So that's where it starts meeting with the papacy and understanding what that jurisdiction of Rome meant and where it's crossed a certain line that the model actually helps to set a line and helps to show why the Orthodox have a problem with the papal position. And I find it a very useful tool. It gives a very helpful way of describing exactly what the problem is.
Yeah, wow, yeah, thank you very much, Father. I was about to say, just initial impressions, I was really appreciative of you elucidating like the ethical and moral responsibility parts when you were talking about husband and wife relationships. And then, of course, the Orthodox position and concerns about the Catholic view of primacy and the papacy. I do want to get to that, but I kind of want to, what I want to do is I want to get to that a little bit later because I kind of have a certain way I'm thinking of this interview.
Yeah, that's fine.
I definitely do want to talk, like believe me, I do want to talk.
I know.
But first, I want to ask you a question, but I'll make a comment first. The comment I found funny because I was a Calvinist for a while, so it's funny in the beginning when you're talking about the relationship and about how we have this freedom to reject God. I always found that a very just intuitively just sensible idea, and many Reformed and Calvinists with their view of predestination rejects basically the synergy of Eastern Orthodoxy. I always found it just kind of funny because like the more I study Orthodox theology, the more I think one of the great things about it is it stressed about human culpability and responsibility and free agency, and that you're not determined to do this. Like this is like hey, the mistakes you make, that's your mistake, dude. Like, so you gotta like, you know, own that. And I understand there's Calvinist ways of understanding responsibility, but I've always just found them not as satisfying as Orthodox explanations. Yeah. And there was a time where I was like the complete opposite. I like, you know, hated Orthodoxy and Catholicism and stuff, but you know, nobody's perfect. So the next question though is about Pseudo-Dionysius, and it's something I've observed in reading some Orthodox authors. I want you to help me understand this because I recently read Rome, Constantinople, and Moscow by Meyendorff, and he talks about Pseudo-Dionysius in there a little bit too. And what I noticed in both like his survey of it and then also your discussion too is that you have people that want to say Pseudo-Dionysius was like only a Neo-Platonist, like that's all he was. Then you have others that say, well, he was a Christian. He was like a philosophical Christian. And then others that say, well, he synthesized Neoplatonic categories with Christian thought, which that seems to be my understanding too, because I don't think that's a bad thing, but correct me if I'm wrong, and I would have to probably look it back up, but on the certain page number, but is it problematic if Pseudo-Dionysius was Neoplatonic? Would that undermine anything he said? Because it seems to me it really wouldn't, because it seems to me like there's other like philosophical categories that the fathers use, like ousia or perichoresis or spiration or procession, and they understand the difference between like certain pagan understandings of it and then their Christian understandings, especially like at Nicaea, because like you had, different pagan Greeks or even other theists like Philo that would talk about ousia and God's essence. So help me understand, am I wrong, or like what's going on there?
No, it's a good question. It's sort of entering into a wide debate. It's probably one view among many, but as I understand it, from my point of view, and the fathers all accepted him as a deep Christian theologian.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you talk about being Neoplatonic, you've got to be very careful, because the title itself can imply the pagan, all that comes with the paganism, pagan philosophy, and there's certain things that are very not Christian in Neoplatonic thinking. So I'd be very hesitant to call them Neoplatonic. Now, what I would say is that when you start thinking about metaphysics, there's only so many places you can go to make things sensible. So the idea of the one, the infinite one, is basically the beginning of everybody sort of has to assume that, because if you want to talk about reality in a deeper sense, the only way you can talk about reality is the infinite one. And so Buddhists, Hindus, even animists, and everybody all start with the infinite one, though that might be abstracted away to a certain degree in Buddhism, or animists may not really think about it much. Still, it's there. And in Hindus, they definitely start. Hindu is very close to Platonic. And then, so that is your basic block. So everybody starts in the same place, and Christianity starts in this place, because you really go nowhere else to go philosophically if you're going to describe reality. Where it starts getting interesting is, how do we explain the time-space existence? How does we get from the one stable, infinite, unchanging one to the time-space thing? And that's where you start getting the difference of things. And so you've got the Platonic, the Hindu, the Buddhist model, where they take the whole thing as an eternal existence in its time-space model, and then you start from the one, and then it layers down to psyche, life, and sort of as a sort of a triad at that level, and then it sort of goes down to demigods and gods and things like that, until you sort of get angelics, and then you get the humans, and you go down to the worms and dust and earth and stuff. And so it sort of falls away from God into more material, temporal type of thing, less spiritual. But of course, it can't be an end that way. It can't just keep dissolving eternally. So it becomes a cyclic pattern. It falls down and goes back up again, falls down and goes back, and keeps going around and around like that eternally. So you have a cyclic pattern. And that's a fundamental point of Platonic thinking, Neoplatonism, and Hindu Buddhist thinking. It's all that sort of cyclic thing, trying to explain how the one sort of diverse comes into multiple in time and space, which is really opposed to the one, and then, well, it can't stay like that. It has to sort of go around in circles. With the Christian perspective, you start with the one, and then out of nothing is created everything, which can last in a time space for a limited time, and then it's resurrected, it's brought back into God, into the eternal unchanging existence. So it's a sort of a blip of time in this sort of otherwise unchanging reality, which is a sort of a singular blip. If it can't be a multiple blip, because then there would mean that the reality itself was changing. So, so this is a Christian thing. Everyone has start and an end at point. So these two frameworks, you basically got nowhere else to go. If, even scientists, secular scientists, sort of have the infinite range of multiverses. They sort of struggle, but I think they end up with a lot of philosophical problems, because they start going to this ad absurdum. You've got this explains this. Materialism doesn't work. It's because it's limited, inherently it's limited. It just simply can't explain reality. It's useful to explain the bit we can see around us, but it's useless to actually, as a metaphysical construct. You've got to fall into something, either become Buddhism, Platonic thought, or Christian thought, or Judeo-Christian thought. And I lump in Islamic thought into that. Dualism doesn't really work, which is the only other sort of metaphysical way. You can't have two equal things opposed to each other. This doesn't really work. Anyway, so as far as the idea of the one and everything go, and a lot of the language about the one is very similar, the essence and beyond essence and things like that. A lot of the language of thought where else do you go to describe these things? That the words
that's
very
fair.
common.
Yeah.
But we have a question is he one who has animations going down and then cycling back up, or is he actually have a creation model and then God diversifies into creation and then reconciles into creation, and that's where his model is. He's definitely Christian and with Christ. And so I would just say that though he uses the Greek philosophical language, because that is well, you got really nowhere else to go. You got to just use his tools and words. He's actually putting them into a completely Christian framework, and he's doing so by putting the theology into a really deep philosophical sense of what it has to be. And so that's, and as I said, I don't think there's much else you can go. Once you start asking these questions properly, you come to Dionysius and go, he's put it pretty much bang on target straight from the word. That's why people like St. Maximus and John of Damascus, St. Gregory Palamas, Aquinas, they would just pick him up and go, okay. he's
right, yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. I appreciate you saying, like, especially like the Christian framework, because I would definitely disagree with anyone who would say that like Pseudo-Dionysius was like merely and only or simply a pagan or a neo-Platonist in that sense. I would be like, well, no, he clearly is a theist. He clearly is more than a theist. He clearly believes in a God that gives religious injunctions and has intercedes prayers and has revelation. So like it's very personal God. It's not like an abstract, like a prime mover type of concept in Greek philosophy. So even though it takes that, like, and other Christians too take the prime mover, but they just say that's Yahweh, basically.
Well, this is where actually the theodic relationships comes in, is that because God is personal, the theodic relations work. The bishop becomes, in a sense, the personification of God, sort of thing. So that we are dealing with personal relations, one mind and stuff. So the whole theodic relations, the whole structure of a church, a hierarchy of a church, is one that reflects exactly that type of God. Otherwise, it would be a meaningless construct. So it's predicated on the sense of a God who is personal, loving, being, a knowing being, than as just a pure one. And I also think that it's quite clear Dionysius doesn't sort of start, whereas this is where Christianity, we talk about the one, and then they've got the life and the intellect. I can't remember which way around the Platonic thought goes. But in the Christianity, they're not set, the three of the hypostasis of the triad are not those, and it's sort of a layered thing. But my suspicion is sometimes Roman Catholic thought starts to slip into a sort of layered type of way of conceiving the Trinity, whereas in the Christian thought that each is the one intellect and life. The Father is completely that in himself, the Son is completely that in himself, and the Holy Spirit is completely that in himself. They're not like the three different aspects and different personifications. Each one is completely all three as well, and their diversity is based on another principle. And Dionysius would fit well with that, well, as a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Do you mind, because what you just said there actually made me think. So when you say you think the Catholic view of the Trinity emphasizes more layers, like what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Could you expound on that?
Yes. So when you're talking about it comes out of a filioque way, and so the idea, you start with the one, and then it generates the one first procession is the Son, affiliation. Then the second one is from the Father and Son gives the third in order through the double procession. So it sort of sets a 1, 2, 3 order. And so you start with the one, the Father, who through filiation, you have the Son, and then through the two together, then spirate the Spirit. But there's this sort of origin thing going 1, 2, 3. It sets a real 1, 2, 3, and that starts. And they're using the words of spirations and processions. And they use these generations interchangeably. and they talk about, and they only distinguish between affiliation and spiration by the number of origins. And so though this is not Platonic per se, it starts moving into a layered, we've got the one, then it goes to the two, then to the three, in a sort of way, true to their different processions, whereas the Eastern perspective doesn't do that.
Right.
And so, though it's not like it is Platonic, it's for me, it feels like the language, the way they're speaking about it, the understanding of it moves it, and there's a little bit of the one, the intellect and love sort of thing, where they're slightly personifying the hypostases, so there's the psychological model, but there's a little bit that each personifies each level, rather than slightly, the Eastern model is slightly different, but it doesn't quite do that. It does use a psychological thing, but it's not. It's like each one's not personifying one thing. There is a connection, but it's only a connection that each one is completing themselves, and not and not just simply a personification of these different aspects. So,
gotcha.
It's a trend. It's a feeling. It's not an absolute sense of this is exactly what they're saying. I mean,
yeah.
The theologian, no. But that's my impression of it when I'm looking at it in comparison to the theologies, in comparison, and looking at it in light of Dionysius, in light of Neoplatonicism. I'm going, it's starting to get awfully close of it. Roman Catholic thinking quite as to what I would think of sort of slightly Neoplatonic language and thoughts, more than these Dionysius stuff, an actual consequence. Yeah,
I appreciate that. I'll ask you just like a few follow-ups on that, but I also want to be careful because I know we could really do a whole show on like Orthodox perspective on the Filioque and pneumatology in general. But so is it fair to summarize what you're saying, that even though the Catholic position obviously is not Platonic, the logical trajectory of it leans towards Platonism? Is that fair?
I suppose I'm seeing it getting off. The model seems to be getting awfully close to what I call Platonic model, though it may not be wanting to do so. But the language of processions and stuff, it just starts to taste of Neoplatonic.
I gotcha.
Speaking and stuff like that. So I'm sure other people will debate that there's nowhere near it. But anyway, from looking at them, I can definitely sort of get a taste and the feel of it. And I'm going,
I bet there's so many questions I would want to ask, but it would really derail the conversation, because as you were saying that made me think of different aspects of Palamas' thought and stuff, and I was like, that would be So for the sake of keeping the conversation going where I want to, I'll table that for now. But maybe a future episode with you on the Orthodox view of like monopatrism or something like that would be a good episode and helpful. But going back to something you said before, Father, because in your chapter or in your subsection 4, when you're talking about theodic relationships in chapter 4, you talk about the Trinity and the hierarchy, something you just mentioned before. And it's interesting because you talk about how that, on page 169, if you don't mind me reading you, it said, you say, "This is one reason why the hierarchs are known as fathers of the church. It is also a reason why the hierarchs are male. The name father in the Trinity is not exchangeable with mother. This is because the two roles are not the same in giving birth, and while the father must not be considered in male human terms in relation to the generation of the Son, the eternal generation of the Son is one in which the distinct role of a mother is unnecessary. When Christ becomes incarnate, a mother then becomes necessary for his obtaining human nature, but a human father was unnecessary and would cause confusion in providing Christ with two fathers and distort the purpose of the incarnation in bringing humanity to God as Father, the one Father of all. Because the begetting of sons by the hierarchs is a tangible representation of that of the eternal Trinity, then the hierarch must be Father both in name and in form as appropriate to the human condition. Therefore, the hierarch is male. So I just found that a very interesting way of you putting it, and was a really interesting encapsulation, because it's a similar thing that Zizioulas does in relating ecclesiology with the Trinity, and I do want to get to Zizioulas in a moment, but like yeah, I found that super helpful, because I think sometimes, even if one disagrees with, like, for example, the exclusive male priesthood in Orthodoxy, especially in more Western secular countries where concerns about gender roles and things of this nature are kind of conceived more in terms of positional power than sort of like the religious backdrop. I think that was an excellent excerpt of like you giving the religious logic of Orthodoxy for why it is. But if there's anything you want to expound on that, basically, like, why does the bishop have to be a male? Like, because some people would say, well, that sounds sexist, but like, to kind of expound on that really rich passage, how would you kind of answer that, basically?
Yeah, it's just trying to get my thoughts. The thing that comes to mind is it is about icons. It's not. We are living icons. And what is material because we know things are different in material because they have different form, different shape, different things. It's what we see and touch that distinguishes us materially. And so while a male and female in a spiritual sense can be, there's a human, our nature are exactly the same as each other. One is not to be preferred above the other as far as being a human being is, and in our spiritual sense or anything like that, in our soul, one is not superior to it or even distinguishable from the other. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, in our bodies, we actually have what you can see, exactly what you can see. This is what distinguishes us. And this is what is used for the icon. And what's wise, so that the male becomes a living icon. And what's important is that the theodic relationship, so it's essential that there is a distinction between God and humanity, what God does and humans do. We have distinct relationships, how we're not equal to God. God loves us and rules us. We come in obedience to God, especially since the fall. So what we're actually created to be is reign with God. So that's the other important part of theology. We are created to reign with God, to live and reign, rule with God as equals to him eternally. But because of the fall, mankind needs to come, which is a separation of will for disobedience. Man needs to come back to God through obedience, through reuniting his will to the will of God. And this is why the whole point of obedience is so deep. And this is why the wife does full obedience to her husband. She is a symbol of humanity. She carries on how humans are to relate to God. She covers her head to show being under obedience. She is a living icon of what humans do. But to make the reality of relating to God tangible, the husband has to take a dual role of being man himself and doing obedience to God, but being God to the wife, so that she can tangibly realize obedience to God through her husband or through the priesthood, etc. So, and it's because these are not pure human relationships; they're actually relationships to God, but they are real, tangible ones. This is why we use a specific icon. We use a specific, and the male-female split is perfect. It's all over the place. It's not one nation to another, or blacks to whites and whites to blacks and whatever. That's useless. It's a male-female relationship, which provides a natural image icon. And even as part of that, men grow beards, and they should keep their beards. They can trim them off, but no, we wear our beards because that's why the East is very strong in beards, because that's part of the icon of being a man. It's part of the image, and because we really accept the salvation of physical forms, we don't abstract things away into just symbols to the deeper meaning. We actually say, no, the physical has to participate. The physical is important. So the icon has to be the correct icon. It has to have the proper physical form to represent what it does in a physical manner. You can't swap forms around. You would just deny the physicality and the form of materialism. You'd be actually deny material reality as material reality. So that's why it sort of really hits home that the male priesthood, because we're not led by humans, we're led by God. There is no teacher, but God is the only teacher. Therefore, the teachers of the church are icons of God. They're not teaching of themselves, they're teaching as God. The church doesn't teach of itself. So there's no place for human teaching. It's not like we're all fighting to who. No, as a priest, my job is to simply teach the word of God. It's not to start teaching my own opinion. it's to teach the word of God. That's why I'm there. If I'm starting to teach my own opinion, I've lost the plot. So I'm a heretic. That's what it means to teach my own opinion. And so this idea of grasping or saying that someone's not capable of doing something is to deny the reality of the iconic image, which allows God to be present in humanity in a way that allows the theodic relationships to properly work. And also it's trying to grasp something at a human level. Oh, I'm humanly equal to you, therefore I should be able to. That's what happened at Adam and Eve in the start. It wasn't good, but you can see exactly that's what Paul says. It's exactly the sort of languages he's using. So again, the model, the scriptures just come naturally out of the model. It's all about icons, living icons, and that's why it's again the male priesthood, etc., is there. And anyone sort of trying to argue otherwise, you're starting to lose the point. And this is arbitrary. I mean, God decides which way around it's going. It's not like you've got a choice. But then again, this is a part we also got to realize is why we are free. We are also, God is, he is a creator. We are his creation. So there is a sort of synergy going on of God's desire, God's will, God's plan, God's decision about things, and our own decision, our own plan. So what part of us is we just got to accept what we are, and our position, what is given to us. That's the important part of being Christian, accepting who I am, whether I'm male, female, black, white, in China, or whatever. We just live in this century, not last century. We just got to accept that's part of it. But then given that framework of where we are, making the most of that to unite with God, or we're responsible for. So that's really important part of that. And then the iconic thing is also touches on modern issues of transgenderism, etc. These are problematic, where we should be dressing to our icons. So God also wants us freely participating in our icons. So not only does he give us different form, but he expects us to reinforce that by our own will. So men not cutting off the beards, putting on male clothing as women put on female clothing, growing their hair longer, sort of thing, as appropriate. So the idea of unisex clothing and stuff, trying to change gender, trying to cross-dress, these are an anathema to the icons. And in relationships, male to male, female to female, regardless of what you feel, they're an anathema to the iconic relationship, because the relationship between God and man. And so marriage has to be between the male icon of God and the female icon of man. You can't have two men together as coming to theosis, or two gods. That's distorting the iconic thing, and it matters. The iconic relationships, because that's how God is present, really, truly in matter. And this way, Orthodox are very much stronger about the way we do baptism, the way we use holy bread and stuff. The image has to be more exact. We can't abstract it away. It's given a specific form, and you can't start messing around, because you destroy. But by messing around, you destroy the reality of the physicality of the thing that you're looking at, which is defined by its form and shape. And so that's true for these relationships as well. So anyway, that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think what's interesting too, because it's very a lot of the language that you use to describe this and that orthodoxy is itself too, as it's struck me as I continue to read and study it, is it's very incarnational. It's very anti-Gnostic. It's very matter is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Creation is good. Flesh is good, which is why the incarnation can happen. It's participatory. It's divinizing. It's energizing, and energizing, of course, not in like the secularized, colloquial sense of it, but like in like the Athanasian sense of energizing, energy, and stuff like that. And yeah, it's very fascinating, I think, and it's very consistent, it's very incarnational, if I didn't say that already. But one thing I wanted to ask you though too, this is kind of, I didn't plan to ask this, but when you talked about how it relates to transgenderism, because that actually came up in my mind when I was reading some of this from you. I was like, oh, I could see how this would relate to modern times specifically. This is not meant as a criticism. It's more of, I think, just a statement of fact that Orthodoxy is very pre-modern, like clearly, in its conceptualization of reality. And so what would you say to someone that objected that, well, there's no such thing as, because you use the words like male and female clothing, since they're icons that represent a reality, and that the physical form should represent and express the reality behind it. Which there's so much there you could unpack, but specifically with transgenderism, what would you say to someone that would say there's no such thing as male or female clothing? It's relative towards how people conceive of it. It's basically kind of like, to use a Nietzschean phrase, it's perspectival. It's relative to a perspective. Like that might be the Orthodox view, but it's not basically true for this other person. How would you respond to that, basically?
Well, yes. Again, the way I would see it as Orthodox depends on my faith and my worldview as Orthodox. That anyone can wear any clothing in some ways. At some level, it doesn't really matter. It's just clothing. But because we consider the world in an iconic way, we want to, for the sake of our salvation, we want to make a distinction between male and female, even if that in a human biological sense is not always clear in every case, which is important that it's not always clear, because we're not two separate species. We are one common human flesh. So there needs to be a sort of an overlap. If there wasn't, we would be separate species in which we wouldn't be, Christ becoming incarnate through the Mother of God, we wouldn't be able to save us. It's essential that we have an overlap. So it is natural that there is a sort of physical, and that love is not just simply marital love. There's a multiple level thing, and union is not just simply between male and female. It's a union between all people. So there's a sense of love for all people in all different ways can come out. This is all to be expected because of the singularity of us as human nature. So what we've got a sort of a not an absolute, but there's a movement towards a sort of a clear common distinction between the forms of male and female, which is universal. But it's not an absolute sense, but there's there. And part of that is God's using this as form the icons, and therefore the clothing becomes important, that we reinforce the icons, we reinforce the distinction between male and female in our actions and our choices. And so we, even if we have to choose between being one or the other, some people, so be it, we choose one or the other. And this has become an act of sort of conforming to the will of God, that forming in a way, but not choosing in the sense of denying what you've received. So, in other words, if you're, as some people are born with, which genuinely, it's one or the other, that they sort of mix. Now, that sort of person, in a sense, pick one side or the other and stick with it. But if you're born a male, you don't change yourself to a female, or a female to a male. That's to deny what God's given, what He's created in you, how He's created you. So, and so that'd be an insult to God by saying, "Oh, I'm not good enough to be male. That you've created me. I want to be." Well, that's actually going against God's providence on how you are. Yes. So, and all these things like clothing and things. The key is that this is dependent on Orthodox Christian faith. This is our way of seeing reality. And I'm not going to pose this on the world. It's not my place to tell the world how to dress. But if you want to be a Christian and you want to act in the Christian way and according to Christian principles, then this is important. How you dress and how you define yourself is important as a Christian. But for the world, many of these things are irrelevant, yes. And so I can argue from a secular point of view, equal rights of male and females and all this. No, that makes perfectly good humanistic sense. Whether it's good societal sense is another matter, but it's perfectly reasonable arguments in a humanistic sense, all these things. And as society falls more into humanism and departs from Christian faith and principles, which grounds the way we act and behave, then it becomes less reason to accept the way the Christians do things as a secular man. Of course, the problem in modern society, in my little thing, that is when they start imposing the secular humanistic ideas of male and female on the church, and say, you've got to accept male and female and relationships as we accept it in the world, in the church. It was, who are you to start telling us any more than we are to tell you how we are to behave according to our worldview, our sense of existence and reality. So yes, I'll just sort of say, yeah, that's our faith position. That's what we believe. And in that belief, there's a good logic to it. Of course, you don't accept the premise of the belief of God. So of course, the logic's not going to work for you. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. That makes a lot of sense. And what I want to do now is kind of, so there's really a lot I want to cover actually before, and if I don't cover everything, which probably won't, I would love to have you on for part 2 to go into more stuff. So yeah. All right, Father. Well, so I appreciate that. So in chapter 5 of your book, you go continuing from chapter 4, well, no doubt, but of theodic relations specifically, and you talk about the implications. And from pages 179 to 194, where you have your conclusion, you talk about territorial boundaries, limits of the church, hierarchical deposition, translation of bishops, local parishes and dioceses, scriptural interpretation, relationship stability, and synodal membership, marriage and ordination, marriage after ordination, and then your conclusion, and then your bibliography. And what I wanted to do is actually kind of continue, because what I've done in your book, there were certain things I underlined, and I think what I want to do kind of just methodologically is kind of maybe go through some of those and kind of either ask a question about it and whatever, and we'll see where we're at basically time-wise after that. But I want to ask you, just in terms of just an overview of chapter 5, what if someone asked you, Father Patrick, what is the implications of theodic relationships? Like, how would you just put that in a nutshell before we go more in depth?
Well, the implications, part of the idea behind it is that saying just obey the canons of the church because they are actually there for a good reason. That don't despise them and say, oh, they're old-fashioned and traditional. No, they're all there because they protect theodic relations. They're all there to establish a correct way of working as the church. And the old traditional ways of doing things are there, not because they're just with old traditional ways of doing things from society. They're there because they actually have a deep meaning on how our relationships should work to come to salvation. So it's yes, and so basically all the implications just reinforcing the received tradition, and it's just saying, yeah, don't mess around with a tradition. There is a good, coherent logic behind why things are done as they are.
Yeah, that makes me think of a quote from G.K. Chesterton, where when he was talking about, I think, tradition in general, or the concept of orthodoxy, small o, in general, about he's one of the examples he gave, if I recall correctly, is that if you have a house that's near a cliff, and there's like woods behind it and stuff, and you question what the point of the fence is, so the fence essentially is for safety. It's to keep you from going off the cliff, or he has other expression where he says basically, just that the more succinct form is, before you try to remove a fence or gate, ask why it was put up in the first place, because there's typically a good reason. And so I'm just seeing like what I've had underlined from the last portion. Sorry, just bear with me.
That's okay.
So, well, what's funny? Oh, okay. The most I've underlined actually is on your conclusion, because I felt that it really summarized a lot of what you talk about in the book. So I guess what I'll do is I'll read this and we'll kind of work backwards, because it does go into some other stuff that I wanted to ask first. But I underlined this section on page 194 through 195. You say, quote, this gap was addressed by focusing on a layered synodal structure as seen in St. Leo the Great and understood in terms of the apostolic choir, and then bringing the various aspects seen in Cardinal Dooley's ecclesiology models and those in other theologians, together through the contribution of theodic relationships. Theodic relationships bring together institution, mystery, sacrament, herald, servant, and discipleship. They are consistent with and even require a synodal structure that layers to converge on one see, thus uniting local churches in the global church without one taking unbalanced priority over the others. Also, the issue of local parishes in one church is addressed, allowing for present practice without altering a structure that is arguably present in the first century. This structure also helps to reconcile any differences of understanding between Western fathers, such as Pope Leo the Great and Gregory the Great, with Eastern fathers who rejected the form of papacy developed in the 11th century. The focus on St. Peter and on Dionysius helped to develop a perspective that goes beyond an explanation of the hierarchical position of St. Peter exclusively in terms of the See of Rome, and beyond even his role in terms of the hierarchy of bishops as seen in St. Cyprian. The place of St. Peter is considered to be of profound importance for the entire structure of the church, from the Pope to each private family and monastic eldership. In singling out St. Peter from the other disciples, naming him rock, and providing him the keys to the kingdom of heaven, one establishes the heart of theodic relationships that present Christ to man and unite man to God. The singularity of St. Peter points to the one Christ to whom all are united, and that union and unity are core to deification. The rock, among other things, signifies the presence of Christ, the rock upon whom the church is built. The keys to the kingdom of heaven that Christ is said to give to St. Peter establish that it is through theodic relationships that we are saved and that our sins are forgiven. So I know that was a lot, but I think that quote really helped summed up the entire book of what you go through. And just from that quotation alone, I just want to ask, because this is a similar thesis I've heard from when I read, golly, it's weird how time flies. I was about to say I read this book in 2019, which I felt like just like yesterday, but whatever. But Papadakis, the Christian East and the Rise of the Papacy. So he has a similar thesis about that the papacy that emerges in the 11th century and 12th century, and then eventually solidifies, and then eventually the logic that expands into Vatican I in the 19th century, essentially was based upon a disjunction or a rupture of, and transformation rather, of the papacy, predicated upon the Gregorian reforms of Pope Gregory VII, if I recall correctly. And even though you can find, many have argued, and you can find inklings of this in Pope like Nicholas I, for example, with the Photian incident, which you also reference in your book. Let's talk about that for a little bit. I know there's so much we could talk about, but what would you say are the basic differences between the papacy of the 11th century and the first millennium, to put it that way?
Right. I've touched on this a little bit before. So what you see in St. Leo the Great is you see a model of convergence to one see, which he's referring to Rome. And this is for unity, for churches are unified around one see. And you've actually got a problem in some Orthodox ecclesiology now, which that's not properly understood. There's a sense of all equal and everybody's sort of, you've got these sort of like separate patriarchates, which sort of like little mini popes and stuff, but each one is sort of utterly equal to itself. And that I'm finding very problematic. It's quite clear that there's a unity around one see, and St. Leo speaks, and even Eastern churches have this. It's just understanding exactly how that is realized. And so what we get, this part is more, goes back a little earlier. So the first thing I do, before I carry on, there's two aspects I'll talk about. There's one about what the one see is, and the second one is the sense of, which I talked about earlier, respecting the rights of the other sees, the jurisdictions of other sees. So the first thing about what the one see is, what I think happens in the West is that Rome is always the symbol par excellence of the one see. It is the one rock. It takes on the symbol of the rock, the symbol of the Petrine See, most perfectly of all the seas. So it is the exemplar of it. So the fathers will talk about Rome and the Apostolic See, etc. And now, so you've got this already from the start because of its sensible come to one see, and it's the exemplar of that. So Rome sort of takes on a specific singularity. However, what doesn't happen at this stage is that if you read St. Gregory the Great, he talks about the one see in three. The one see is represented in three bishops, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. They are one see. So what we've got here is while we talk about Rome as one see, as the exemplar, it's not exclusive of the participation of that one see of Alexandria and Antioch. They are both Petrine sees. The Petrine See is not just Rome, it is Alexandria, and they are rocks as well. That is what the meaning of a Petrine See. And so when they speak of the Rome here as an exemplar, it's not exclusive of the authority and positions of Alexandria and Antioch, to the extent that in the early ecclesiology, the Miaphysite, the Monophysites, and the Syriacs quite rightly actually separate from Rome and continue to be in communion with Antioch or Alexandria as the Petrine sees. And they can justify that Rome is not necessary for being with a Petrine see. As long as you're with Alexandria and or Antioch, you are still united to the Petrine See and the rock. And so otherwise they would have had a massive crisis immediately separated from Rome. So this is from the 9th century, you start to see an increasing exclusivity of the position of Rome, to the stage where you get to 11th, 12th century, where Rome is the Petrine See, the others are not. It becomes the fullness of the Petrine See of itself, to the exclusion of the position of Antioch and Alexandria as Petrine Sees. It is just simply Rome. So you've got this sort of subtle movement, this switch between one that's inclusive of them, which is St. Gregory the Great, to the exclusion of a singular, absolute, singular one see, universal see, to one where that it is a singular, one absolute universal see. And then this is coupled with the next part, which is the jurisdiction. So when you're looking at Leo the Great, he talks about unity, but he's very strong in protecting the rights of the metropolitans. What are the specific rights of metropolitans? Ordaining bishops in a territory. That's their job. The patriarchs didn't ordain the bishops in the territory. And we can see this right is also expressed in Chalcedon, the famous Canon 28. Putting aside all the part about the equality of New Rome, what's really important here is that New Rome was told not to interfere with the rights of the metropolitan sees and ordaining the bishops there. So even though he claims the equality of Rome, he's not to interfere. So this reinforces exactly what St. Leo fights constantly is these what's called exarchs who look after a number of provinces, interfering with the role of the metropolitan sees in their see in each of their provinces. And so he's defending these exarchal sees who have got multiple provinces under them from interfering. And you can see this in Canon 28. It does exactly the same thing. Constantinople don't interfere. They were. St. John Chrysostom and others were interfering, and they said, no, don't do that. So you get this very deep tradition of preserving the rights of the metropolitans. And the bishops, of course, were preserved the rights of their own ordination of presbyters, deacons, and stuff. And you get right back to the apostolic canons, the bishop alone. Anyone who goes into another territory and does an ordination without the bishop's consent is slammed. And there's no sort of saying, oh, it's okay for metropolitans to do that. No. So the hierarchical was always respectful of the jurisdiction, the rights of those underneath. Though metropolitan had a wider view, nothing could be done across all the province without his consent. He had no right to interfere within the jurisdictions, which is why the early synods were consensual. They're not majority rule. There's no imposition here. This again goes back to this freedom of authority. Each bishop must consent because he is in charge of his thing. So his consent for when anything actually be done in his has to be with his will as well, to be exercised in his diocese. It can't be exercised contrary to his will. Now, there is an exception of a couple of bishops being just obnoxious occasionally. But the principle is consistent. Why? Because no one can force anyone in their diocese to do anything, the see itself. So even after the ecumenical council, they have to run around, even though the ecumenical council expresses the word of God at the council. It is defined. It is God's will is spoken at the council. Full stop. The council is finished. It is God's word. It's not received as becoming God's word afterwards. But nevertheless, there's a process where everyone has to receive it in their own diocese because it's not forced upon anyone. If they refuse it, of course, they'll be cut off from the church. But nevertheless, there's a process of everyone confirming and asking them to confirm it because it's not imposed upon anyone. That would be interfering with the rights of each bishop in his territory and each person in their individual sense to own the faith for themselves, to have that freedom and self-authority in all these matters. So you get the structure. But in the 11th century, you start getting the things, the Bishop of Rome can ordain a presbyter a cleric in any diocese in which he wants. And this is a fundamental denial of that specific rights. And this is a change of how the instead of being a see, it sort of coordinates everybody, looks at everybody, writes letters and goes, what are you doing? You idiots. But it's jurisdiction looking everywhere and just checking to see and being a sense of communion. Everyone binds around sort of Rome. Yeah, of course, because we have to be one church, but from one but it's still respecting the local diversities, local jurisdictions. If they break the canons of the church, yes, I'll interfere, but not in, you decide to use this right or that right. And again, you can see this trend when they're imposing the universal right on the church. Everyone must do it this way. And even more modern times, everyone must do no vote. There's like centralization, which you can see, especially taken off from the 11th century, where everyone's doing what the first Rome. Instead, what happened before is everyone copied Rome because it was like the first see. We'll do everything as Rome does in England because we want to be like Rome. It's like the where all roads lead. It's the common witness. That's why Rome is chosen to be the first see, because it was the capital of the empire. It was the place where everybody was looking. So the see which sets the example for all the other sees is in the place most obvious and visible to the world. You don't put it in some little wee town of the middle of nowhere. No. You place it in the center of all communication, so everyone looks to Rome, and then everyone copies. But that's different from it imposing itself. So everyone copied, but everyone did their own thing as well. So each place had local diversity. So you had the Gallican rites, you had the English rites, and you can see this in the way Benedictine monasteries were taken in the early centuries in the West. They all took it and said, we follow St. Benedict, and then they all did their own thing. They followed in basic form, but they had a lot of localization. But that's what's supposed to be local rule. Everyone has their own authority in their territory to tweak things, but they all sort of keep a common pattern. But Rome changes this. No, you must do it this way. Here's 4 prescribed rites. You 5 prescribed. You have to do it this way, this way, this way. You can't go off and do your own localization. And so this is where things start changing, is that respect for local rule, local authority within the common tradition changes. And so it's very subtle. You can see it's a subtle shift between being the exemplar and a sort of authority to keep everyone within the canons of a church, to be one where it's imposing itself in the customs and rites and stuff. That's why the ecumenical councils could criticize Rome for its customs, because it's like, no, you're doing things wrong because you're not following the common tradition. You're starting to go off into your own little thing. And so Rome wasn't removed from that. And that's, again, so the structure where as soon as Rome becomes singular and imposes itself all through, then it's necessary to become infallible. It's immediately you start going down there. It has to be infallible, it has to never fall, etc. Because it comes under St. Gregory the Great's point. If the first see falls, the whole church falls. That's why once you get to that singularity point, you've got to go for the whole infallible status, never changing. The Orthodox model it spreads it out. Why we converge to 1 see, it's spread into 3. Why? So it allows human freedom. So none of them is infallible in himself, but by regard providence of God, they're protected. But if one can fall and the other 2 can carry on, sort of thing, it allows some scope for bringing to unity without necessitating an absolute infallibility of any one of them. So 1 or 2 could fall and the other one could carry on by the providence of God. He's not forcing anyone to have to act in a particular way, but it's still without losing the sense of unity. And so 3, Constantinople is a bit of an interesting quirk on that, but it still stays 3 with Constantinople. It allows that coming together as one, but gives enough flex for individuals to fall off and to mess up. So that's why the Orthodox way of seeing it. And when that was removed or felt unnecessary, then something had changed.
Gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate that, Father. I have a few clarifying questions that came to my mind as you were talking. One would be, do you think that, because my other questions are kind of dependent upon this one, do you think that the Bishop of Rome, or as the Patriarch of Rome, to use the old expression, the Patriarch of the West, do you think its primacy is only, because you mentioned it being the capital of the empire, do you think its primacy is only political and canonical, or do you think that there's a divine, not necessarily Vatican I, but just in any other conception? Because I know Ubi Petrus says a similar thing where the Petrine ministry, and specifically, if I recall correctly, if I'm misrepresenting him, then anyone out there correct me. But I've at least heard the arguments that there can be a conception of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome being divine, but still it being in a more sort of like higher papal type of understanding of primacy, but still not Vatican I at all. So would you accept that or deny that, that it has a divine?
I'm quite happy to accept something like that. I don't see any contradictions or anything like this. I think there's a certain baggage which comes with the idea of being the divine institution. And so one of the times talking to Roman Catholics is when you say something like this, it's a sort of either or. Once you say that, they assume you mean all this other stuff. It has to be there. And it's like, right. No. So what you get the early church. Now the church comes from Israel, becomes a church of the Gentiles. Right? The church does need a centralizing see because it's got to converge to one. Otherwise, you can't have multiple different churches, and you've got to keep one tradition and stuff. We don't want to start fragmenting into lots of different Christianities. Things. You want to have one tradition, and we're bound together, bound to hierarchical relationships. That's why we're bound. Ignatius, you can't. If you're not with the bishop, you're apart from the churches around his hierarchy, and the hierarchs themselves are bound together around these concentric things. So, of course, it's going to be one see, and and it's, again, everything's territorial. It belongs in territory. It's grounded on earth. Now, you don't want to start picking the one see and going, oh, you're the most holy see, or you're
Right. Yeah.
So what do? You've got to find one see for the nations. This is going to be the first church of a church of nations. First see of what would be the obvious symbolic thing. Now, that see is also based on cities. Why? Because the bishop is a gathering of human population to one place. The city is a natural, iconic place for a bishop to be, with a gathering of the church into one place. So the city is a natural form. So we're going to be looking at cities, and we're going to be looking at a city which is going to represent gathering of all the people together as one. Well, there is one really powerful symbolic city sitting around that does exactly that. Rome, the capital of the empire, the sea to which all people look. It's just absolutely the natural place that the church in that sea should carry the same symbol as that city does, in the secular sense and the ecclesiastical sense, as being the first see around which everyone converges, as all churches converge on this, is the centre of unity. That makes absolutely perfect symbolic sense. So it seems to me that in God's will, that it's obvious that the apostles would go to Rome, and that the see that would become the primary see of the first see should be in the city that's a primary city of the world, at least symbolically. It's symbolic. It's not what is that you have the Chinese empires and whatever, and it wasn't like the absolute city that rules, but in the symbol of the Roman Empire as the Mediterranean world in which Christianity was born, which God defined the Roman Empire. He brought it into being exactly to carry this symbol as the city, the empire of the nations. It covers all nations, many nations, not absolute sense, but in a symbolic sense. It carries the symbol. And so the city becomes a symbolic center. Now, the other principle that's important here is that while it's chosen because it's a capital city, by the will of God, and the apostles, the chief apostles, Peter and Paul, both go there to establish it and ground it, as well as Peter grounding Alexandria and Antioch as well, one through himself being there in Antioch, and the other one through disciple, to define them as Petron sees, as the second and third sees of the empire. Once the see becomes establish its place amongst the churches, it doesn't change. It becomes traditionalized. It doesn't. The church is unchanging. So it doesn't matter if the city itself becomes more or less important in a political sense. The see stays as it is because it's carrying the symbol still, and its place among the other churches is permanent. So it doesn't fall out. Now, that permanence is a symbolic. It doesn't mean absolutely that the bishop on that see will always not be a heretic or fall away. But the structure, you don't, unless he does become a heretic, it doesn't transfer or change or fall away. So there's a permanence in the structure, which transcends the political. So the political is only there to establish the structure in the first place. It helps to provide the symbolic basis for any territory of ordering the churches in that territory. Now, it's not an absolute sense. In the British Isles, for example, Canterbury became the first see because it was the first see founded. It was at the time the place. So London didn't sort of take over. Canterbury remains the first see, even though it's a small town, really, in comparison to London. It still carries, because it becomes traditionalized, it becomes the first see in tradition, and it doesn't change with the political waverings of the cities. And the canons are quite clear about this. So we can put both together. God's will is that the Free Church is in the place most iconically appropriate for it, obviously the capital of city of Rome. So you can talk about it in two ways. Yes, it was put in the capital because it was the capital. Yes, it is a divine choice. Yes, it was the actions of Peter and Paul. All of them are equally true. It depends on which angle we're looking at it. Again, in Roman thought, it just becomes the divine choice. and the fact that it was a capital empire sort of gets lost on the side. And the East is like, well, no, it's also true, and that is ultimately why Constantinople is recognized in its position. And I can talk about that now or later, as depending on.
Yeah, well, probably later, because like there's still a million other things. So I'm just very particular in my ordering of things. But I guess the other few, and I also just want to kind of be concise on this too, is so clearly the major difference, because like you see in writers, like Catholic writers and scholars, like patristic scholars like John Chapman in the early 20th century, he basically held that yes, the See of Rome was chosen because it was the see of the empire and because it was divine. But it does seem to me, and well, not only does it seem, I think it is the case that I think the real issue, because there's Orthodox and Catholics that both say there's a political element to Rome's founding and there's a divine element. I think at least between the high papalists of like St. Mark of Ephesus and others, other type of Orthodox, and I think yourself, and just correct me if I'm wrong as I'm about to explain this, that so you have the high papal Orthodox that are that still deny Vatican I, and Catholics both agree on divine institution and founding. Jesus gives Peter the keys of the kingdom. To us, Petrus, all that, right? You're Peter, and so there's the divine aspect, a Christological aspect in terms of Jesus granting the keys. What seems to be the fundamental difference is when Vatican I says, and even some other popes in the first millennium say something approximating it, though not the entire exact words, that the See of Rome will basically will last into perpetuity in terms of its orthodoxy, and so it has a sort of divine immutability in a sense. And I understand. I don't want to get into the issues of like Honorius or John the 22nd. Like that would be better for another episode. But just to say, insofar that at least there's a certain Catholic explanation of like those things, but I don't, kind of putting that on the side because that's not really what I'm trying to get at, is essentially Orthodox would disagree and would say that no, the See of Rome is either, in terms of primacy, it's not immutable, or it's at least transferable to like Constantinople, or it doesn't, there's uncomfortability with like the church basically depending upon one guy, essentially, like with one bishop, if he falls, then the church falls, type of thing, and that's a real concern. And so, hang on, I'm trying to think how else to put it, and then I'll ask your response. So I guess, yeah, just basically what Vatican I says in terms of perpetuity of the divine office, and that the Pope will be protected by a charism of infallibility. Do you think that's a fair assessment that represents your view of like the divergent disagreements and agreements?
Yes, well, it gets a little bit more subtle, I suppose. So in other words, I can say I agree with the fathers about Rome's permanence, because in a sense I have to, because the sense of the unity around the one See requires that one See to remain in the tradition perpetually. It's not, it can't sort of disappear and there, because you sort of lose the center of unity. So it can't be just transient in an absolute sense of just fluffing in and out. So the distinction here is, we've got to be careful, is that we accept it, but not in an absolute sense. So in other words, the See is to be talked about as perpetual and rock and not falling. Yes, so we affirm that because we have to serve from it. Because if you start talking about, oh, I can just fluff in and out and like that, no, you actually sort of take over providence of God and the whole one of the point of the rock of the Petrine Sees. But So I can affirm that, but not in an absolutist sense. In other words, that Rome wasn't absolutely protected from it. So you, in the first century, had Honorius, and then in the 10th century had this huge scandals of popes, which they were so scandalous that they didn't even get around to actually teaching anything to go into heresy. But Rome was in a really bad state. And so we have these little points before, but it didn't stop it from doing what the biggest problem it could do is become exclusive to itself, that it is infallible in and of itself, that it is the only thing. When you come to that, there is not much God can do in that. When you start twisting that becomes the heresy in itself, and it becomes a sort of almost impossible heresy to break, because as soon as you start collapsing into the singularity, well, then I am infallible. There's a sort of a level of pride and the other thing, but what can God do? Once you actually start teaching and holding this specific tweak on it, which is what happens in the 11th century, then it, as it says, excludes and distorts the whole model. But it sounds like it's continuing the model, but it's actually a subtle change on the model. So it's moving from God's providential care in the context of occasional falls, etc., and in the context of respecting the rights of the others, and in his providential care of Antioch and Alexandria as well, and Constantinople for that matter, to just exclusivizing it to old Rome as such. And that, I think, is where we differ. So we accept some of the potential thing, accept what the fathers say, but when it's sort of got distorted to become an exclusivity to that and that single, and then it was sort of nowhere to go other than for it to actually cease in its function, and that perpetuality of it is continued in the Patriarchy as it is in Alexandria and Antioch and Constantinople, which from the Orthodox point of view have stayed perfectly Orthodox in and out for little bits until the present time, and now we've got some interesting things going on. But we can claim that stability. If you talk about the fathers talking about school, we've got it. We've got the Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch in the church pretty solidly. He's the old heretical patriarch and one or the other sees, but the triumvirate of them have pretty much stayed solidly Orthodox for the last 1,000 years without any major scandals. As I said, there's the old one. And so, wow, well, what evidence is that to say that the promise hasn't been fulfilled in the Orthodox conception of the Patriarchy and of Rome? There's none. It's just as equally good as, in fact, it's probably better than and doctrine sense, and the consistency and the coherency and the unchanging sense of doctrine and practice of a tradition is much better and more stable in the East than it has been in Rome, where it collapses into simply the will of the Pope. Whatever he decides, it becomes what you actually believe, because even if one contradicts the other, the one who's presently on the throne takes place. And this is what's causing some problem, angst for a lot of the ascetificationists and stuff like that. Is
right.
We haven't got a pope anymore, etc. And they've got some legitimate questions because they're trying to hold the logic of a tradition being stable and the papacy being stable, and it suddenly becomes I think it actually becomes impossible to reconcile the two. So you've got to go back to the Orthodox model, give it space to breathe, because you end up with what I think in the West is and I see it in the change of tradition as well, the change of the canons. You don't have to fast from midnight on. You can just fast 1 hour before. These sorts of things. You might say that, or then you get the problem. Oh, these are just discipline, they don't matter and stuff like that. Again, in Orthodox, now you're starting to mess around with the physicality of the incarnation of Christ as he comes out in his physical symbols and in the physical way which we approach, and the days which we fast, Wednesdays and Fridays. You're starting to mess around with this. You're messing around with the incarnation of God. You're abstracting it some sort of Gnostic thing where this thing doesn't matter. All that matters is the faith. There's some sort of abstraction of the faith through some sort of loose symbols. And the Orthodox, you've just sort of started sliding off into some sort of Gnostic sphere. or Protestantism, it's sort of in that way. So, yeah, this is a critic. So we can say it's true, but in a way which probably even the fathers of the first century didn't quite expect it to be true. But it continues in the Alexandria, New Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. And so, yes, it just wasn't the way that people thought about it being done. So, yes, I can affirm it. Now, another point was the idea of transfer.
Yeah, right.
I find this, people really struggle with this. Constantinople, because Constantine, when he founds the city of Constantinople, he founded it as a clone, a replica, or even more, the reality of what old Roman Italy means as capital. So it is Rome as not in a geophysical position on earth, but it is Rome as it is the capital of the empire. It is the same city as defined as capital, not as defined as being on the Tiber River, but as defined as the Senate, the capital, the seat of the Roman Empire, the center of the Roman Empire. So for all the reasons why the Peter and Paul went to Rome, because it was the city, not because it was sitting on the Tiber, not because it was of geographical position. That wasn't relevant to them. It didn't matter if it was there in Lyons or something. It was a symbol of what it was in the empire as a city. Now, when Constantine made Rome, it wasn't because the emperors ruled from a certain things, like other cities like Milan and near Caesarea and all these other ones where the emperor had resided and ruled basically from. They were never called Rome's. Constantine actually made this city Rome. He chose it as New Rome. He got 7 hills and everything. So what he really said, this is Rome. It's not just simply another city which we rule it. He's actually saying it's the same city as old Rome. And that's why the fathers, when they look at the canons, it's because it's New Rome. It is Rome. And because the city is Rome, the bishop of a city is the bishop of the city of Rome. Therefore, he must, being the bishop of the city of Rome, have the same privileges as the he has all the privilege of the bishop of Rome, and so that's why they created them equal. But it's not transferred from Old Rome to New Rome. Old Rome still is the capital. As a matter of fact, because it's the first, it is the exemplar. It is the model from which New Rome's only Rome because Old Rome is Rome. It's not taking it over. It only remains Rome because Old Rome is Rome. So its identity as Rome is, and it comes in second. And now to stop being 2 heads of a church as such, Old Rome takes precedence. That's why New Rome is second to Old Rome. And so you see afterwards that Old Rome still has a precedence over New Rome. But as far as being the Bishop of Rome and all the privileges that belonged to New Rome, as given by Peter and Paul because of it being the capital city, the bishop would have all these privileges as the first see of a church. New Rome carries all the same privileges. It states it is the Bishop of Rome. And you can see in the history of the church afterwards that in all effect in the East, everybody copies New Rome. So all the liturgical rites all follow New Rome, just as all the sees in the West follow Old Rome. It carries the same presence, the same authority as Old Rome did, but in the East, because it doesn't interfere with the jurisdiction of Old Rome, it doesn't replace it. But it carries only after the schism of Old Rome does it stand more fully in the place of Rome. So in the Eastern things, not only do we have Constantinople, we have Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch still. All that is carried on today. We lost nothing. The fact that the Old Rome went, we lose nothing because New Rome had everything that Old Rome had. But it will always remain second to New Rome because we don't want to cause separation of two heads. But as soon as Old Rome steps out, New Rome can fully and totally and completely take over the role because it has all the privileges of the other see. So the church has lost nothing of what there was to be Rome. And so we can say, the prophecy about Rome, the apostolic, carries on. Now, we don't call it the apostolic because Peter and Paul didn't go there. but as far as all the privileges that were retained,
right, canonically,
it carries them. So we make that distinction. Then there's this theory about angel and stuff like that. I don't know how good or true that is. It doesn't really matter so much. But it's not transferred, it's not shifted, and it can only be established because the emperor of the Roman Empire says this is Rome, the same city, and all the symbols are created. The Senate's put there, all the seven hills, all the things that define Rome as the capital, all the institutions, etc., are established here. So that's why the idea of Third Rome in Moscow doesn't work, because that's not. It can take a symbol of Rome to a certain degree, but it can't be the city of Rome, because only an emperor of the empire, which is a city in this Rome, can define what Rome is. And then it has to be built in a secular sense. It has to be true in the secular Roman Empire. It can't be, that basis is defined by the secular Roman Empire. It's not defined by the church or anything like that, or the Christian trying or another nation outside trying to model it. And that's quite important. That's why there's, in a sense, the two. You can't, it's not bouncing around and multiple things. It just becomes, and that it's like, I always liken it to Peter and Paul. Peter is the one who receives he's a leader. Yet out of nowhere, not even allowed to be apostle by the rules of which they chose Matthias over the thing, comes along Paul. He was persecuting Christians, is not able to be apostle by rules, and yet God says no, he's an apostle. And not only is he apostle, he's equal to Peter as apostles of Gentiles. As a matter of fact, he becomes greater than Peter in his actual letters and stuff. Peter carries the symbol of the authority, but the reality is that Paul is the real leader, and they both go to Rome. They both have go to Antioch, and Mark was the disciple of both Peter and Paul when he goes to Alexandria. It's not just of Paul. He leaves the discipleship of Paul, and then goes meets up with Peter later, and then comes back to Antioch. So both of example, and so here we have that Constantinople seems to come out of nowhere, and it's not an apostolic see in a sense of its foundations in a normal sense. But that doesn't mean that it can't be truly Rome and carry all the privileges, just as Paul takes on the same thing. And in a matter of fact, becomes a leader and carries the weight of it onwards. So, I hope that makes some sort of sense.
It does. Yeah, it does.
To define a couple of these issues about exactly what is meant and understood.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I have one. Well, I have several follow-up questions, but one I have is this. So, this is just out of genuine curiosity, really, because I've heard different Catholic apologists kind of make this a particular point, and I'm not really convinced it's like a point against Orthodoxy or for Catholicism or vice versa or anything. It just seems like an interesting question. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong to isolate it and try to neutralize it or to make it neutral. But so the traditional Orthodox understanding, like in St. Mark of Ephesus and other Eastern writers of and some of the disputers and debaters at the Council of Ferrara, Florence, for example, talk about how Rome had leadership and primacy and stuff, but it fell in the faith. And they would either say it fell in the faith because of the Filioque or because of Beard or Azymes or papacy, all these other issues, of course, I know you're very familiar with. But I guess one thing that I'm interested in, though, is like, well, if Rome fell, why didn't the Orthodox just make another Patriarchate of Rome? Because if they're heretics, just replace them, right? I mean, wouldn't you do that?
No, that's very good. That's a very good question. Now, having added to this, the prophecy about the thing about Rome remaining, and matter of fact, there is still a bishop of Rome today. The see of Rome, old Rome, still exists as a city and as a see. From the Orthodox, it may have a heretic, but in the sense, there's still a preservation of the see, regardless of whether there's a heretic sitting on it or not. It is some form of continuation from its original see, which is interesting. The other problem is that there's two things. One is a practical thing. When Rome went, because of the hierarchical nature of the sees, it took all the ones under it with it. However, actually, having said that, it's a bit thing. Greece used to be under Rome, old Rome, but Greece ended up under Constantinople. That wasn't part of Constantinople's original territory. So there are parts, Greece and some parts of Illyria and stuff, which actually become under Constantinople's jurisdiction, some bit before, some bit after the split. So it wasn't exactly everything. But generally, the whole West fell with its head. And this is part about hierarchies. If the bishop falls, the church underneath him goes with it. We are linked together by these hierarchies. And so when the hierarchies fall, the church goes underneath. Now, the interesting thing about, so partly there's no Orthodox in those areas from which to minister, to create a congregation for them, because the whole lot have become separate, joined and remained in union with old Rome. It wasn't like bits and pieces were breaking off and they had to sort of bind them in.
Right.
They sort of gone off. So there was no one there for whom to establish something. Then there comes the question of jurisdiction. Whose right is it to go into the territory of old Rome, to start doing a new bishop of Rome? So because you have to be the local people have to elect their own bishop. So who is the right to come and start choosing it? So if there's no local people to choose, and then there's a question of who's got jurisdictional rights to go in there, starts making it difficult. This is one of the reasons why sort of Orthodox jurisdictions are in the diaspora here still name them after seas and where they have jurisdiction. They're just sort of floating out into other territory, but they still say, well, we actually don't have jurisdiction to start creating sees and patriarchs, etc., in the West. They'd have to sort of repent and do it themselves, could be one answer. So I think now that doesn't mean I'm sort of two minds. I think there is a good case for that there's just simply no jurisdiction for anybody to do that. It would have to sort of be a repentance of the people themselves, and then sort of asking someone to do some ordinations, inviting them to come across, not them imposing themselves on them, but being invited to come across and establish bishoprics, which I would argue should all be the re-establishment of those that are already there. We shouldn't, the Orthodox coming here, if they're going to make bishops, shouldn't be making new ones. They should be reviving the ones that are traditionally here in respect of what the fathers have given to this place and established. Should be reviving the ancient, pre-schism sees, not creating new ones. So you're respecting the authority of those gone before. So yeah, if there is a case, maybe it can only be managed by exarchs that are bishops of territories in Turkey, sort of thing, which is no bishop sitting on, and they just, and he comes over and ministers here. That might be the only solution. I don't know. We have got a bit of a mess in Orthodoxy at the moment. There's all sorts of jurisdictions in the UK and the US which shouldn't be there. They have no right to be there at all. And this is one of the major problems in Orthodox ecclesiology at the moment. But this is because there has been a counter against Rome, which is why I'm a high papal position, which creates a huge mess because everybody feels like they've got rights to be everywhere. And my PhD says, no, you don't. You haven't got rights to be outside your territory. The only see which does is Constantinople. Well, there's two arguments here again. Constantinople claims everything beyond anyone else. And there's a certain universal jurisdiction Rome had, which is legitimate. Obviously, that jurisdiction was, and when Rome was there, Rome was Western Patriarchate, Constantinople never interfered with Roman territory. And what you do get is when the two clash with each other, that you sort of get the squabbles and fights, and the emperor either decides, or the locals to say, we want to go with you or not, or with you. So, but that's their freedom. They choose which patriarch they would prefer to be under. So there's a little bit of tension at the borders, which is fine. Now, so the other one is that you can do missions as long as it's contiguous to your borders. So Russia can keep doing mission as long as it's contiguous to its previous jurisdiction and doesn't go so far as to encroach in the given territory of anyone else. So it's got to be careful how far south it goes, because it's the east belongs to Antioch. Now, Antioch, the bishops of Antioch only really say for definite they go out into Persia, into Iran, sort of thing, their jurisdiction. Though it's interesting, if you look at the Miaphysites, the Indian church always recognized the patriarch of Antioch. So it does seem that Antioch, probably of the east, should go all the way out through India, and arguably China is its territory. So when it comes to Southeast Asia, definitely Russia shouldn't be jumping across to there. Now, the US and north of US could be Russian contiguous. But when you start pushing too far south, it's like, well, actually, that's Western territory. It's like ex-Roman territory. There's this case where actually Constantinople should be taken over, or Constantinople should be doing the surrogate of Old Rome. So it should be where Old Rome territory, New Rome should be looking after that. That makes sense, because it doesn't belong to Antioch or Alexandria or Russia. They've got no right to be in that area. So Constantinople, because it's Rome, can surrogate for New Rome and manage those things. I think there's a very strong argument for territory in there. Unfortunately, it's been broken down. The Russians and the Romanians particularly, but they've formed into some sort of ethnocentric thing, which is a danger of Orthodox ecclesiology if it's not kept strong on the centrality of the Petrine sees and the position of Constantinople, which Constantinople is arguing for, though Constantinople is unfortunately arguing for it in a way which is starting to slip into not respecting the rights of other bishops. And so in Ukraine, for example, there has a right in a sense to say, well, actually, I'll take jurisdiction back over Ukraine. It had no right to be taking what were schismatics. He had a right to say the schismatics must be received into the church. He had no right, though, to displace the canonical bishop and say, oh, no, you're no longer that. No, he has to respect the rights of that were there, the establishment, the local metropolitan. He was the one who was meant to take the schismatics and tell them where to go and make them bishops and priests, etc. The Constantinople could say, you've got to receive them, but it's the right of the Ukrainian church to decide how they're received and where they're put, etc. They could be received in orders, etc., but they had to be received. So that's his mistake. He's interfering. This is a papal thing. Oh, sorry, I can keep going for hours.
No, you're fine.
Falling of the Cretan Council. This is where it's fascinating. We've lost the emperor. Now, in Orthodox, because no one had authority. Oh, this is another important thing about what the PhD says. The See of Rome, there was never a synod of patriarchs. Now, so you get synods of the metropolitans of all the bishops. They meet twice a year. You sort of have a synod of the patriarch, which deals with all the patriarchal things. But usually that's his local metropolitan synod, which with a few add-on bishops that come visiting and join in as a synod. So it's not really a synod of all the metropolitans coming together. It's more of a synod of his local bishops making sort of wider decisions for people. But there was no synod of higher than that. And that's what that meant, is that Rome authority for the singularity means you can order people into a synod to come together to meet. Rome had no such authority to order the other bishops. So it was a truncated authority. He had a universal sense. He could write letters to everybody, can complain and moan and groan everywhere, and try to send someone to send his opinion to sort out church matters. But he could never call in a council of all the bishops of the world. He had no authority to do so. And that's really important, because if that council defines something heretical, the whole church therefore becomes bound to heresy. So this is not only is he not the singular one, he can't call a council, ecumenical council, because one bishop does that and then everyone's bound by it, and that happens to be a heretical council. Then the whole church becomes bound to heresy and collapses. So to avoid this, the emperor as a useful tool. It's like, oh, hello, Why is emperor a useful tool? Well, because St. Paul says in Romans, we must obey the emperor. We must obey the civil authorities. Well, the emperor has universal authority. So if he decides to call every bishop to council, we must obey and we can come into council. Oh, emperor, can you please pass a law to order everybody into council so we can form a council because we can't do it. And so the emperor, it doesn't matter if he's pagan even, he can call the council. Now, obviously, a pagan emperor wouldn't be interested in doing that.
Right, yeah.
Stunning to Constantine, who was still a pagan at the time he called the first ecumenical council.
Yeah.
He was not a Christian yet, but he called it as an emperor, as a secular capacity. And this is why it's not Caesar-papism. The emperor could only call the ecumenical council because he was not a member of a hierarchy of the church. Precisely because he's a secular emperor and only a secular emperor, because he's not Caesar-papism. That's the only reason he could do it. And the symbolic nature of a Roman emperor was emphasized at the First Council at Nicaea, because Eusebius says people from Persia and everywhere in Scythia all came because of a call. In other words, his symbol as an emperor of the world was recognized even in the Persian Empire and in Scythia and outside the empire. So this is why Rome was such an important symbol for the church, because it carried a symbol beyond its borders of the ruler of the world, sort of thing. So he calls it, he can't argue in it, he can't interfere with the decision. That's why one of the bishops has sort of said it's the first. But also this means that all the bishops come as equals. They all discuss the matter equally. Each bishop in little villages, small towns and stuff, get equal voice. It's the big ones. It's not hierarchically structured according to the church hierarchical structures. They're all hierarchical structures are represented. They are not. It's not formed on that. It's formed by the emperor calling, and there's equality. And so everyone decides, and there's a unanimous assent. Again, when I talk about unanimous, we don't talk about it in an absolutist sense. We talk about it in the sense that the whole crowd yelled. Well, not every single person in the crowd yelled, but it's so many yelled that you can't say that everyone didn't, that some people didn't yell. It's not like a quarter didn't yell. It was it's like everybody yelled, except, you might find 3 or 4 people who didn't yell, but, So we must understand, we're not talking about an absolutist sense, but we're not talking about it as a majority sense. We're not talking about a sort of defined majority. We're talking about it as everybody except maybe 2 or 3 who don't want to do it. And the First Ecumenical Council, I think it's 5 bishops who did it. There are exceptions. It's not a rule of democracy. Now we've got modern times where we're going back to the Crete now. The problem of Crete is that the patriarch, as when we lost the emperor, who calls it? And so one of the things is that the patriarch becomes emperor and patriarch in one person. So this was an argument in the 19th century, early 20th century by Alexandria. And I think this is dangerous, because you start to confuse these 2 roles. You start to, if a whole heretical council, the whole thing will fall apart. And the bishop, and this is why it didn't really work, because not everyone accepts that idea. And Antioch said, "Oh no, we're not necessarily going to Russian. No, we're not going." Thankfully, it sort of saved it. And then the councils called into hierarchical structures, like Council of Primates, and it was a majority decision. This is not ecumenical council. This is the wrong ethos. It's the wrong feeling. So Constantinople is going into some of these wrong. It's not crossed the border yet into what I call a heresy, but it's showing signs of actions of disrespect for jurisdiction, a sort of almost a papal authority to call people into council and stuff, which I think is dangerous and a slippery slope. But it's sort of falling short from going too far that way. So, but then we've got Russia, which is now a patriarch, thinking it can judge New Rome on itself. It's like, excuse me, because the church is quite clear in the canons that you can only condemn the patriarch of Rome, or any of the patriarchs, only really because if they are preaching a predefined heresy, or it's a heresy of such like the filioque. Well, actually, filioque, you could say the Ecumenical Council of 8th Ecumenical Council of Photius, the 779, as we call it, really did say you can't change the creed, and there was absolute disobedience to a rule of the church in Rome, and a teaching which is basically was sort of pretty much slammed, by some Photius. But putting aside that, because generally we can't say that judge a patriarch for heresy, and this is an ecumenical council basically called to say that he's been done that. So unless he's preaching a heresy, like he's preaching Arianism or some Gnosticism or something like that, which is predefined, the councils will already judge it. So we judge the same way. We don't judge differently to them. We judge. So he's condemned because they've condemned him, not because we've decided that. Because you're respecting his authority. We're not. And so otherwise, you've got to stay in communion with them. And so that's why Russia is sort of saying he's acted badly, therefore he's schismatic. Well, no, Russia's no right to be judging. He's got no jurisdiction to judge ecumenical patriarch. It has to call an ecumenical council to do that. B, it's not a matter of heresy. And C, actually, with the See of Rome, if it receives schismatics into its communion, by definition, schismatics are no longer schismatics. You can't come into communion with Rome or Alexandria and be schismatic. Unless Alexandria or Alexandria is in schism for all the other Orthodox patriarchates on its own. And so the whole logic of Russia is away from this unifying model of St. Leo the Great and St. Gregory the Great. But anyway, that's my little rant for now.
No, I really appreciate that, Father. It was fascinating because it was just multi-layered, and also I was interested too because I was curious what your thoughts of the intervention of Constantinople in Ukraine was. So I appreciate you sharing that, and also your just general thoughts on Bartholomew, and because in the news, I've heard Russia accuses Constantinople of or the theologians of the Fanar and anyone in communion with Bartholomew as guilty of the sin of papism and things of that nature, which is interesting. But I guess a clarifying question or follow up would be, it seems to me historically, at least with the issue of Ukraine, well, not Ukraine specifically, but just canonically, that the Patriarch of Constantinople has the right to grant autocephalusy. We see this, for example, in the 9th century, where Boris I, the emperor of the First Bulgarian Empire, goes to Photius to ask him to grant autocephalous status for Bulgaria, and Photius says no. And then he's like, well, I guess I'll go to Pope Nicholas and kind of be a jerk about it and cause trouble between the two, which I find kind of just funny. But Boris is just a fascinating character. Saint Boris is an interesting character. But anyway, so we see this historically this right of Constantinople to grant autocephalusy to those under its jurisdiction. But you're saying that the issue with Ukraine specifically is that Constantinople can do that, but it displaced and deposed the regular rightful canonical bishops in Ukraine to begin with, which is problematic and illegal canonically. That's what you're saying?
Yeah. Now it's very complex. Now, right of autocephaly is not simply that of Constantinople; it's any patriarch. So. The church in Georgia was underneath Antioch. His mission was kind of from Antioch, quite properly, because the patriarch of the East, and it was under Antioch. And Antioch granted it autocephalous status. Now, later, Russia took over and it just assumed it into its own status of the Russian Empire, moved over that way, quite uncanonically. And then later, Constantinople recognized its autocephalous again. Now, having said that, it is quite correct that when an autocephalous nature is given to by one patriarch, say to Georgia, everybody else recognizes that. And Constantinople can dispute, in fact, but the right of actually doing it is the one who has the jurisdiction over that territory by allowing that territory, but is in its jurisdiction to manage itself, to relinquish its rights to do so, granting the autocephalous thing because it was in its territory. Now, all the mission of Russia was missions from the missionaries of Constantinople, all from the Balkans and stuff. So the whole thing was under its territory as far as its contiguous missions going forward. Now, eventually, Constantinople was racist, for want of a thing, and keep sticking Greeks on top of these other C's. And of course, they got fed up with this. Instead of putting locals in charge and just rubber stamping local choices, which it should have been doing, and this had a particular reason to not want it. They, of course, had demanded their separation and autocephalous, all because of political things like Boris.
Right. Yeah.
Which is why it lasted for a while. Then it was sort of the empire took it over again. They just sort of quickly squashed it. Which is actually better. You shouldn't be having too many patriarchs, because the danger of too many patriarchs is you get nationalism. And this is what's happening in Orthodoxy now. You get the patriarchs just fall into Patriarch of Romania, Patriarch, and then the church quickly can fall into nationalism, to being identified with a nation state. Now, it's really important that the church takes on national flavor and it takes on natural characteristics. So there is a church of in the Romanian sense, of the Romanian language, etc., and in Serbia, and etc. This is really important that the church, but it should be underneath a transnational patriarch, so it doesn't collapse into being identified with a particular national group and customs like that, which is because it can fall into nationalism, which is a Jewish problem, because that's what wrong with the Jews, that they're a nation, we're a chosen nation. They confuse human nationality with salvation, sort of thing, and that is a danger of all humanity. And this is one of the weaknesses of Orthodoxy at the moment, is having granted this, and that's why Constantinople was quite right to try to refuse to grant it. But political pressures came along in its own sort of lack of really thinking about what it was doing, and the Turkish problem. It's all a big mess. Anyway, so Russia eventually granted, but Ukraine wasn't actually part of that. Ukraine remained under Kiev, remained under Constantinople. It's not till later with the Uniates and stuff, sort of things got confused, that eventually Russia was given the right to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev. And what's happened since then is that everyone's assumed that the Ukraine, or the metropolis of Kiev, was always part of the Patriarchate of Russia. But actually it wasn't exactly. There is an argument to say it's not. And so Constantinople has an argument whether to reclaim jurisdiction of the metropolis for itself, the right to ordain. They had no right to start deposing them arbitrarily and saying you're no longer bishops and stuff like that because you don't agree with me. No, that was completely. But the right whether or not to claim the right and then grant it autocephalous status. Of course, again, forcing the autocephaly is another matter. It shouldn't be doing that. It should.
I wanted to also. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, I also wanted to follow up on when you were talking about Crete, as well, about the issue of like being at one time simultaneous emperor and patriarch, and how that's a problem. Do you agree, or do you think? Because it seems, at least from my reading of like history, that I think it was the atheist Christopher Hitchens and other people have made a similar comment that in the Tsar's Russia, the emperor wore both the crown and the black cap of the Orthodox Church, as it were, like the patriarchal. So, do you think that's fair, or that's kind of more just prejudicial, or that there was a sense in which sort of the Tsars kind of ruled the Church and the state? Russia started to become in a messy situation. Yeah, Russian Church with Peter the Great. Not so great. not much less than great. And Catherine, not much less than great, effectively made the church a department of state. Effectively became like the UK, where the Queen is the head of a church and head of state. And then a whole lot of other problems were coming. Whereas in Russia, the priests were becoming almost a class by birth. The sons of priests became priests, etc. It became family, and this is again really contrary to Orthodox practice and stuff. They almost, but not quite, fell into a canonical difficulty or disobedience in that. So the church in Russia was in seriously bad shape,
by the time of the revolution, sort of thing. Ecclesiological, it just sort of actually reappointed its own patriarch. It's sort of coming back out, but no, it was in a real mess. And unfortunately, it's partly fixed and partly it's still sort of caught up in that. So I wouldn't say we crossed the border of going too far in these things, but I think there's an argument to be made that it was sort of getting very close to it, and I could see people, atheists who were sort of a little bit more looking at things a bit more shallowly, could definitely make an argument for it, even if it wasn't exactly the case. So yeah, things did start getting a bit dire in Russia with the relationship between patriarch and emperor and becoming part of a state, and it was, and that was very bad. In Russia, it led it way down the wrong path. Now this is one of the other modern dangers, is that we've got the Russian tradition and the Greek tradition and stuff, where there's confusing holy tradition and the canons being the ethnic customs and stuff like that, and somehow because Russia's Orthodox, whatever it does as a church, or whatever Greece does as a church, is Orthodox, and it's like, no. You could be going for, and we don't think things instantaneously happen. Things have been going wrong for centuries before things are cut off. But it's like in Rome and Constantinople, New Rome. There were problems in the West for, as far as the East were concerned, for 700 years. I mean, they're just minor problems, but they just got escalated to the point where we're not really actually teaching and preaching the same thing anymore, are we? No. And this, I think that such a thing could be rising between Russia and the Greek churches, Constantinople and things like that. Music, iconography. There is a movement back in Russia towards some of these older traditions, but way the church is run and stuff. There is a growing schism, divide between the two, sadly, which grew for centuries. Communism has preserved it from getting any worse in many ways. In some ways, these things are a blessing, these sort of crushing, it doesn't stop it getting worse too quickly, and it preserves souls. So God is very tolerant of us. So, but because He's tolerant doesn't mean we necessarily condone these things as okay. It's
right.
Looking at traditions. So
yeah, I appreciate that, Father. Yeah, well, Father, I really appreciate you coming on. This will be, part one. I'd love to have you back on for part two, because there's still a lot of more questions I have to ask and follow up about stuff related to Vatican I and other things in ecclesiology and other figures too, like Zazoulis and Athena Sev and Schmemann that we didn't get to. We'll have to talk more about that too. So, but is there anything, any plug you want to give for, or anything that you're working on at all, or that you like to tell, or where can listeners find you and so forth?
Nothing particular I'm working on. Always happy when anyone gives my book a plug or critique. I'm interested in people's views on it, and reading and thoughts about it. It's putting it out there, as I think is a helpful way of understanding ecclesiology, that is a good explanatory tool for the traditions of the church. In other words, the way things have done, it sort of provides a sort of a model, a framework saying, yeah, of course that's the way. It sort of coheres the tradition in a sense, and a way of thinking about it to help. Yeah, that's why we do things the traditional way. They're not just sort of thrown together by accident. They're coherent. And it helps, I think, give a very good explanatory tool how to deal with the issue of the papacy and Orthodox ecclesiology and intra-Orthodox issues and things, which I think some of the other schools of thoughts floating around are not so helpful at addressing. So yes, so I encourage people to read and think about that. And yes, I'm more than happy to come back on. I'm sort of float around Facebook on the Papal Primacy group and Filio group. I make odds appearances, less so now online. People ask. I don't want to have my own show or anything like that. I'm always willing to be a guest to anyone, but I don't have my own channel or anything like that. I'm not a universal teacher of all mankind, so it's not for me to put public universal teachings out for people to listen to me. But if someone wants to ask me and film me talking to them, I'm not going to complain what happens to that thereafter.
Gotcha.
So yes, I do have a blog on WordPress. It's called Sacred Traditions. On WordPress, where I write articles from time to time. And there's someone that commissions me for odd articles for Reason of Theology. I've got a few articles sitting around there. So, or they can just drop me a line of Facebook as my John Ramsey, as I appear on Facebook. But you'll see me floating around on Papal Primacy group. That's right, in the Filioque group.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Father. And I'll provide links in the description for the blog. And also, everyone, go check out the debates and appearances Father Patrick has made on Reason and Theology and Pints with Aquinas, debating Eric Ybarra and Swansona. Those were excellent debates. Really enjoyed them. So yeah, well, everyone, this has been episode 16 with my guest, Father Patrick Ramsey, talking about an Orthodox perspective on primacy and ecclesiology on his book, The Church, Deifying Relationships. All right, everyone, have a good night and God bless.